The morning Evelyn Beckett arrived in Dustcreek, Wyoming, the sky was the color of a bruise, and every man in town turned to look at her like she was either salvation or trouble, and most of them hoped she was both. She stepped down from the stagecoach with a single leather trunk, a hatbox that had seen better days, and the kind of squared shoulders that told anyone watching she had not come this far to be made small by any of it. The year was 1874, and Dustcreek sat at the edge of the high plains like something the wind had blown there and forgotten to take back. It was a cattle town, mostly. There was a general store, a saloon called the Iron Spur, a church that leaned slightly to the left as though considering whether it was worth the effort of standing straight, and a land office where men went to argue about property lines that weren't always theirs to argue about. Evelyn had come from Cheyenne, before that from Ohio, and before that from a life that had not treated her especially well. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, with gray eyes that caught light in a way that made people uncomfortable when they were lying to her. She had been a schoolteacher in Cheyenne for 2 years before the schoolhouse funding was cut by the territorial government, and she had spent the last 4 months living in a boarding house and taking in sewing and teaching reading to minors' children for whatever those men could spare, which was, as it turned out, very little. The advertisement in the Cheyenne paper had read, "Dustcreek, Wyoming, schoolmistress needed, board and modest salary provided. Apply at the land office of Mr. Harold Fitch." It was not a glamorous offer, but it was solid, and solid was something Evelyn understood the value of. She found Mr. Harold Fitch inside the land office, which smelled of pipe tobacco and old ledgers. He was a round man in his 50s, with a pleasant enough face and the look of someone who had learned long ago to avoid confrontation. He shook her hand formally and showed her the schoolhouse, which was a single-room building at the north end of town with 4 windows and a pot-bellied stove that he promised worked well in winter. "There are 17 children enrolled," he said, leading her across the dry dirt street. "Ages 6 to 14. You will be expected to teach reading, arithmetic, and basic composition. The school year follows the planting and harvest schedule, so you will have summers and falls reduced considerably." "That is fine," Evelyn said, looking at the schoolhouse with the kind of careful attention she gave everything. She checked the door frame. Solid. She looked at the floorboards, worn but not rotted. She tested the stove latch. It worked. "Your lodging is at the widow Hester Crane's boarding house 2 streets over," Fitch continued. "She is a good woman if somewhat particular about meal times." "I am very punctual," Evelyn said. Fitch looked relieved. She moved in that afternoon. The room at Hester Crane's was small and clean, with a window that faced east so the morning sun came in first thing, and Evelyn decided she liked it. She liked Hester, too, who was a tall, spare woman of 60 with iron-gray hair and a directness Evelyn found refreshing. Hester told her at supper which was stew and biscuits and a slab of dried apple pie. That Dustcreek was a decent enough town, that the saloon kept to itself mostly, that the Ramsey Ranch was the largest operation in the valley, and that Evelyn should avoid the creek road in rainy season because it flooded something terrible. "Flooded last spring so bad it took Henderson's wagon right off the crossing," Hester said, serving herself more pie without ceremony. "Man was fine. Wagon was not." "I will keep that in mind," Evelyn said. She did not yet know that the creek road would matter to her in any significant way. She did not yet know the name Ramsey meant anything to her personally. But that first supper at Hester's table, with the wind coming in off the plains and rattling the kitchen window, was the last quiet moment she would have before Dustcreek began to rearrange everything she thought she knew about herself. The school opened on a Monday in late September. Evelyn arrived early to build the fire in the stove and arrange the readers she had brought in her trunk, second-hand McGuffies that she had bought herself in Cheyenne because the town had not provided any. The children came in 1s and 2s, ranging from a solemn red-headed boy of 6 named Thomas who sat in the front row and stared at her with enormous blue eyes, to a girl of 14 named Clara who sat in the back and watched Evelyn with the particular suspicion of someone who had been disappointed before. By mid-morning, Evelyn had taken the measure of all 17 of them and decided she loved them collectively, even the 3 boys in the middle who kept passing a carved wooden frog between themselves when they thought she wasn't looking. She confiscated the frog. She gave it back at the end of the day. The children told their parents the new schoolmistress was strict but fair, and that she had laughed once quietly when Thomas had read the word catastrophe as catastrophe, and then explained very seriously that it was about a cat. Word traveled. It was at the end of her first full week that Evelyn first saw Jacob Ramsey. She had gone to the general store, Bellamy's General Goods, run by a stout, cheerful man named Pete Bellamy, to purchase ink and lamp oil, and she was standing at the counter doing the precise arithmetic of what she could afford when the door opened behind her, and a man walked in that the entire room acknowledged without quite looking at directly, the way people acknowledge weather. He was tall, not dramatically so, but enough that she noticed it. He wore range clothes that had seen serious use, a dark canvas coat with the collar turned up against the October chill, and a hat that had been rained on so many times it had given up any pretense of holding a formal shape. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 32, with a jaw that held 3 days of dark stubble and brown eyes that moved over the room with a kind of habitual alertness that was not nervousness but something more like vigilance. He had the hands of a man who worked with them, constantly broad and calloused, with a scar across the left knuckle that Evelyn noticed when he set a list on the counter. "Morning, Pete," he said. "Jacob." Bellamy nodded. "Give me a minute." Jacob Ramsey, for she would learn his name shortly, stood at the counter and did not fidget. He did not look at her. He looked at the shelves behind Bellamy with the same neutral attention he had given the room, and Evelyn found herself mildly irritated by this, which surprised her because she generally preferred not to be looked at by men she did not know. She completed her purchase. She was gathering her paper-wrapped parcels when Bellamy said, "Miss Beckett, you met Jacob Ramsey yet? His family runs the valley's biggest cattle operation. Jacob, this is Miss Evelyn Beckett, the new schoolmistress." Jacob Ramsey looked at her then. He had the most direct brown eyes she had ever encountered, not unkind, simply very much there. "Miss Beckett," he said, and touched the brim of his battered hat. "Mr. Ramsey," she said. That was the whole of it. He turned back to his list. She walked out into the October air. She told herself, walking back to the schoolhouse, that there was nothing remarkable about the encounter. Men touched their hats at women every day in Dustcreek. It meant nothing. She repeated this to herself with enough firmness that she almost believed it. Jacob Ramsey rode back to his ranch that afternoon thinking about almost nothing, which was his usual state on the ride home. He thought about the north fence line that needed repairing before the cold set in. He thought about the cattle count from Thursday that had come up 3 short, and whether that was wolves or simply a miscount. He thought about his foreman, Dade Sullivan, who had been nursing a bad cough for 2 weeks. He did not think about the schoolmistress with gray eyes who had stood at Bellamy's counter doing arithmetic in her head. He was very deliberate about not thinking about this. The Ramsey Ranch occupied a broad flat in the valley east of Dustcreek, with the mountains visible as a blue wall to the west and the creek, Sawyer's Creek, running along the southern edge of the property. It was good land, well watered, and Jacob had inherited it from his father 6 years ago when the older man died of a heart that had simply worked itself out. His mother had returned to her sister in Missouri after that, and Jacob ran the ranch with Dade and 2 permanent hands, plus seasonal workers for roundup. He was not unhappy. He was also not happy in any particular way. He had learned to exist in a kind of steady competence, which was a different thing from contentment, but served well enough when you had land to run and animals to care for and fences that needed repairing before winter. He had been engaged once, 3 years before. A woman named Louise from the town of Cordon, 40 miles east. She had decided after a year of correspondence and 2 visits that ranch life was not what she wanted and that she was sorry, and she hoped he understood. He had understood. He had been fine. He had gone back to the north fence line and worked for 4 days straight, and after that he had been fine. This is what he told himself. Dade Sullivan was sitting on the porch steps when Jacob rode in, wrapped in a wool coat that was too big for him in his current diminished state. He was a lean, weathered man of 45 who had ridden with the Ramsey family for 15 years and who could read weather, cattle, and men with equal precision. "Water's up in Sawyer's Creek," Dade said, by way of greeting. "Been raining up in the hills all week. You watch that south crossing if you're going to town." "I came the long way already," Jacob said, swinging down from the horse. Dade watched him with the specific look he reserved for when he was about to say something Jacob would ignore. "They say the new schoolmistress is a fine-looking woman. She teaches school," Jacob said, leading his horse to the barn. "That doesn't answer what I said." "It answers what you meant," Jacob said, and went inside. Dade smiled at nothing in particular and went to check on the evening fire. October moved through Dustcreek in the way Wyoming Octobers do, golden and brilliant for a week, then cold and iron-gray, with the wind picking up off the plains and the cottonwoods along the creek losing their leaves in sudden dramatic gusts. Evelyn settled into the rhythm of the school, the boarding house, and the small contained world of the town with the methodical thoroughness that was her nature. She was good at her job, more than good. She had a quality that the children responded to, a combination of genuine seriousness and a quiet humor that came out unexpectedly, like sunlight through fast-moving clouds. Clara, the suspicious 14-year-old, became her best student and most reliable helper. Thomas, the solemn, red-headed boy, learned to read 3 levels above what anyone expected of him and took to carrying books under his arm with an air of great importance. The parents approved. Hester Crane approved. Harold Fitch approved in the vague way that men who fear confrontation approve of things that give them no trouble. The town approved of her. She approved of the town with reservations. It was rough in places, and she was not naive about what roughness meant for women who were alone in it. She had seen enough in Ohio, in Cheyenne, to know the specific arithmetic of being a woman without family in a place that hadn't quite decided whether to take care of her or use her up. But Dustcreek, so far, seemed to be taking the former approach, and she was grateful enough for that. She encountered Jacob Ramsey again at the church social in mid-October, which Hester insisted she attend. It was a potluck supper held in the church hall, which leaned slightly less indoors than it did outside, with long trestle tables and the smell of roast meat and cider, and too many people in a warm space after weeks of cold. The women of Dustcreek had arranged themselves around the food tables, and the men clustered near the door with the instinctive desire to be close to an exit. Jacob Ramsey was near the door. He was with 2 other ranchers, and a conversation that had the look of being about cattle prices. He was the only man in the room not making an effort to talk about anything other than what he actually wanted to talk about, and for some reason Evelyn found this restful. She was helping herself to corn pudding when she became aware that he had moved and was standing approximately 3 feet to her left, also serving himself corn pudding and not saying anything. "Mr. Ramsey," she said to get it done. "Miss Beckett." He looked at the pudding, then at her. "My mother used to make this. It's never as good anywhere else." She had not expected him to say anything real. She had expected a pleasantry. "Is your mother not local?" she asked. "Missouri," he said. "She went back after my father passed. Didn't take to ranching without him." "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, meaning it. He nodded. There was a brief silence that was, surprisingly, not uncomfortable. "How is the schoolhouse?" he asked. "Cold in the mornings," she said, "but the stove is good. I have 17 students and 4 of them are genuinely remarkable and the rest are coming along." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the same neighborhood. "Tom Aldridge's boy is one of them, I'd guess. The one reading everything in sight." "Thomas," she confirmed. "He read an entire geography book over the weekend. He told me about the Nile River for 20 minutes. This time the expression made it all the way to a smile, brief and real, and changing his face considerably. He had a good smile. She noticed this the way she noticed useful things factually, without particular emphasis. His father will be glad to hear it, Jacob said. Tom barely reads, always regretted it. They stood and ate corn pudding in a silence that was almost companionable, and then Reverend Whitmore corralled everyone into songs, and the evening moved in other directions. But Evelyn walked home with Hester thinking that Jacob Ramsey was a man who said fewer words than he felt, and that this was not a common quality, and that she found it interesting. She did not, she told herself firmly, find him anything more than interesting. November brought the first real cold, and with it, the news that complicated everything. Evelyn learned it from Hester over breakfast. There was to be a dispute at the land office. 3 families, the Crawfords, the Hadleys, and the Pikes, were claiming their homestead rights were being threatened by an Eastern Railroad company that wanted to run a spur line through the valley. The company had sent a man named Harlan Cross to negotiate, which meant to pressure, and the families were frightened. Their homesteads were their everything. They had no other land, no money behind them, nothing but the ground they'd broken and the houses they'd built on it. Evelyn had seen this before, or versions of it. The machinery of distant money rolling over the particular lives of people too small to stop it. She felt the familiar cold anger at it. She went to the land office that evening, not because she had any official standing, but because Clara Hadley was her student, and the Hadley family's 160 acres was what Clara's future rested on. Fitch was there, looking miserable. Harlan Cross was there, a pale, narrow man in a good suit, who had the practiced confidence of someone who won arguments because winning them was his profession. 2 other ranchers were there too, including Jacob Ramsey, who had come, Evelyn guessed, because the railroad route would need to cross the corner of Ramsey land to reach the spur, and because Jacob Ramsey did not seem like the kind of man who stayed away from things that mattered. Cross presented his case in the smooth language of legality and inevitability. The railroad would bring commerce to the valley. The families would be compensated. This was progress. He had the papers, the company backing, the territorial weight. The ranchers pushed back with the blunt language of men who live by what they own. Fitch wrung his hands. It went in circles. Evelyn waited, as she often did, for the right moment. Then she said, in the clear, steady voice she used when she needed a room to hear her, "Mr. Cross, the homestead families you are proposing to displace have federal homestead rights filed under the Homestead Act of 1862. Those rights are not negotiable on the company's timeline. The compensation figures you have quoted are below market value and below what the territorial court would require. And I suspect you know both of those things, which is why you are here in November, when the roads are difficult and people are distracted, rather than in the spring when everyone would have more time to think clearly." The room was quiet. Cross looked at her with genuine surprise and then with something less pleasant. "I was not aware the schoolmistress had a legal education," he said. "I don't," she said, "but I can read, and I have read the act, and I have read the 3 previous territorial cases that involved similar claims. The families should hire a lawyer. There is a good one in Laramie. His name is Frederick Hull. They can win this if they fight it properly." Cross recovered his composure and said several more smooth things. But the meeting had shifted. The ranchers were firmer. Fitch had stopped wringing his hands and was writing something down. Jacob Ramsey was looking at Evelyn with an expression she couldn't quite read, steady and considering. She rode back to Hester's in the cold dark, feeling the tight satisfaction of having done what she could, and the familiar fatigue that came after. The railroad dispute did not resolve quickly. It would, in fact, take until the following March. But the families hired Frederick Hull, who was indeed a good lawyer, and the case ground forward in the territorial court. Harlan Cross made 3 more visits to Dustcreek over the winter, each one less comfortable than the last. The homestead families kept their land. It would cost them money they barely had for legal fees, but they kept their land. Evelyn became, as a result of the November meeting, someone the families trusted in a way that was separate from the schoolmistress relationship. The mothers brought her problems. The fathers tipped their hats differently. Clara Hadley looked at her teacher with something approaching reverence. And Jacob Ramsey, who had watched the whole winter unfold from his quiet position at the edge of events, began to find reasons to be in town more frequently than ranching strictly required. He was honest enough with himself to know what he was doing. He had turned 31 in October, and he had lived alone on the ranch for 6 years and had been fine, until September, when a woman with gray eyes had stood at Bellamy's counter and done arithmetic in her head without asking for help or apology. He was not a romantic man in any theatrical sense. He did not write poems. He did not make speeches. But he knew the difference between before and after, and Evelyn Beckett was very clearly an after. He found reasons. He brought firewood to the schoolhouse when the supply ran low, because he was passing anyway. He attended the December church service, though he had not been reliably present at church in 3 years. He went to Bellamy's on mornings when Bellamy had mentioned Evelyn came to replenish her ink supply. He was not subtle. Dade thought this was hilarious and said so repeatedly. "You rode to town 4 times this week," Dade pointed out one evening with the satisfaction of a man who has been waiting to say something for some time. "The supply order was wrong," Jacob said, "and the time before that, the fence post timber, and before that, Dade." "I'm just noting the frequency," Dade said, grinning. "Note it quieter," Jacob said. But he was also slowly having actual conversations with Evelyn. Not contrived ones, he was not capable of that, but real ones that grew from the situations they found themselves in. She came to the schoolhouse one afternoon in November to find him repairing the front step, which had cracked, because Pete Bellamy had mentioned it and Jacob had, apparently, come to town for something else and simply had the tools and the time. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. "The step was cracked," he said, by way of explanation, not quite meeting her eyes. "I noticed," she said. "I had put a wooden block under it to keep the children from tripping." "I see that." He looked at the block. "Good thinking." "Thank you for doing this," she said, and she meant it without any extra weight, which he found restful. He worked. She went inside and graded papers. When he was done, he knocked on the frame. "It should hold the winter," he said. "Would you like coffee?" she asked. "I have the stove going." He did not say no, which was how he ended up sitting on the repaired step with a tin cup of strong coffee while Evelyn sat inside with the door open, grading arithmetic problems. And they talked about whether the valley's weather was worse in November or February. She argued February. He argued November, and neither conceded. And about the book she was reading, which was a natural history of the American plains. And about whether the 3 cows he'd lost last month were wolves or illness, and why it mattered to know which. He rode back to the ranch in the early dark feeling something had happened, though he couldn't have told you precisely what. Evelyn sat by the stove after he left and looked at her papers without seeing them for a few minutes. She had been very careful these past years about men and what they wanted from a woman who was alone in the world. She had learned to be careful, but Jacob Ramsey was doing something she hadn't anticipated, which was not wanting anything from her at all in any visible way. He was simply present, available, like good weather, like a well-built step that would hold the winter. She did not know what to do with this. She graded her papers. Winter hit hard in January, the way Wyoming winters do, not gradually but all at once, as though the cold had been practicing patience for months and finally gave up. The snow came in thick and stayed, and the roads turned brutal, and the creek flooded and then froze along its edges while running fast and dark in the middle. Dustcreek contracted into itself, the way small towns do in hard winters, with people moving between fixed points: home, store, church, saloon, and not much else. Evelyn kept the school open through January, except for the 3 days when the temperature dropped so badly that she could not warm the building adequately despite the stove working full effort. On those days she went to the families and gave lessons around their kitchen fires. This was not required of her. She did it anyway, and the families knew the difference. Jacob dug his cattle out of a snowdrift in the second week of January, which took 4 days of brutal work that left him with a frostbitten right hand and a profound respect for the stubbornness of cows. Dade nursed a chest cold that worried everyone and coughed his way through the month, and the 2 younger hands, a man named Ellis and a boy of 19 named Pete Crane, Hester's own nephew, as it happened, kept the operation running through the kind of physical determination that only youth and ignorance of how badly things could go can produce. Jacob came to town mid-January to collect a doctor's remedy for Dade from the physician, Dr. Marsh, who was a decent man with a tidy office. He came in with snow on his coat and his right hand bandaged, and he went directly to the doctor's, and then he went to Bellamy's, and then he was walking back to his horse when he saw Evelyn coming out of the schoolhouse with an armload of books, navigating the icy street with the particular care of someone who knows a fall will not be quickly forgotten. He crossed the street and took the books from her without preamble. She looked at him, startled. "They're heavy," he said simply. "I was managing," she said. "I know," he said. "Which way?" She told him which way. He walked her to Hester's, carrying the books, and his bandaged hand made her slow down just enough to notice it. "Your hand," she said. "Frostbite," he said. "It's fine." "Is it actually fine, or are you saying it's fine because you don't want to discuss it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Second one," he admitted. "At least that's honest," she said. They reached Hester's porch. He handed her the books. Their hands touched in the transfer briefly through her wool gloves, and neither of them said anything about it. "Thank you," she said. "Any time," he said, and went back to his horse. He rode home with snow in his face, thinking that she was the most awake person he had ever met, by which he meant that she noticed things, really noticed them, all the way through, and that being noticed like that was both unsettling and, he admitted to himself in the privacy of the long ride home, something he had not known he wanted. February was relentless. March was slow and cold, and then, suddenly, warm, the kind of spring that comes to Wyoming like an apology, all at once and too bright after so much gray. The snow melted faster than the ground could absorb it, and the water ran down from the hills in sheets, and Sawyer's Creek, which had been frozen solid and then iced over and dark, swelled and went wild. The creek road, as Hester had warned at the very beginning, flooded. The legal case about the homesteads came to its resolution at the end of March. Frederick Hull sent word from Laramie that the territorial court had found in favor of the families. The railroad company's claim was denied. The land was theirs to keep. It was not a complete victory. There were conditions and some fees that remained, but the houses would stand, the fields would be theirs, the families would not be moved. Dustcreek celebrated in the way small towns celebrate good news, at the saloon largely, but also at Hester's kitchen table, where Evelyn sat with Clara Hadley and Clara's mother and Clara's small brother. And Clara cried with relief, and Evelyn held her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would add to the moment. It was the 1st of April, 1875, a Thursday, when the creek crossing mattered. Evelyn had gone to the Aldridge farm to deliver Thomas's reading primer, which he had left behind at school, and because Tom Aldridge had sent word that his wife was poorly, and he wondered if Evelyn could spare a few hours for the children. She had ridden out on the horse Hester kept, a patient gray mare named Dolly, following the south road that ran along the creek. The visit had taken longer than anticipated. Mary Aldridge was not critically ill, it was a fever, and the doctor had already seen her, but she was frightened, and the children needed steadying, and Evelyn had stayed until supper and talked to them all about geography, and made Thomas read aloud from the primer to his younger siblings, which served the dual purpose of entertaining the younger ones and making Thomas feel important. She left at dusk with the sky still pale in the west and the air full of the smell of wet earth. The creek road on the way back was not what it had been on the way out. The rain that had been threatening all day had come in hard from the north in the late afternoon, and the creek had risen 3 feet in 5 hours. The crossing, a low ford, usually a manageable crossing of perhaps 20 feet at knee depth for a horse, was completely transformed. The water was fast, brown, carrying debris, running at chest height and rising. The ford itself was invisible under the churning surface. On the far bank, the road continued to town. On this bank, Evelyn sat on Dolly and looked at the water and did the arithmetic. Dolly would not cross this. The mare was steady but not stupid, and she sidled away from the bank with the emphatic body language of an animal expressing a rational opinion. Evelyn sat and thought. The long way around added 6 miles, and the dark was coming fast, and the road was already muddy enough to be slow going. She could go back to the Aldridges, but that seemed like an imposition after a long day for them. She could wait, but the water looked like it was still rising. She was still looking at the problem when she heard hooves on the bank behind her, and Jacob Ramsey came around the bend in the willows, riding his big bay horse, reading the water the way a man reads something he has read many times before. He pulled up beside her and looked at the crossing. "South Road," he said, not a question. "I came from the Aldridges," she said. "I didn't expect the rise to be this fast." He looked at the water for a long moment. He looked at Dolly, who expressed her continued opinion by stepping back from the bank. He looked at Evelyn. Then he dismounted. He looped Dolly's reins to a willow branch and came around to Evelyn's side of the horse. He put his hands up, not demanding, not tentative, simply there, and looked at her with those direct brown eyes. She understood. She put her hands on his shoulders and let him lift her down from Dolly, which he did easily, setting her on the bank. He led his bay horse to the willow next to Dolly. He came back to her. And then, without a word, without asking, without making any ceremony of it, he picked her up. Not the way a man picks up something he is handling. The way you hold something that matters carefully, firmly, with the full intention of not letting it be damaged. She was in his arms with one arm under her knees and one at her back, and he waded into the creek. The water hit his thighs and then his hips, and the current pushed at him with serious force. But he moved steadily, testing each step before committing his weight, reading the bottom through his boots, angling upstream slightly to compensate for the drift. Evelyn held still. She had one hand gripping his coat collar and the other pressed flat against his chest, where she could feel the controlled steadiness of his breathing and the strong beating of his heart, which was elevated from the effort but not from fear. The water was cold even through the barrier of him. The spray touched her face. A branch swirled past 3 feet downstream. He turned his body slightly to put himself between her and the main current's debris. It was not a long crossing, 20 feet. Perhaps 30 with the path he chose. It lasted no more than 2 minutes, but something happened in those 2 minutes that had nothing to do with time. She was aware of the warmth of his chest under her hand. She was aware of the absolute certainty with which he moved through water that was actively trying to knock him over, and how this certainty was not bravado but something genuine, something built from years of knowing what he could do and doing it. She was aware of his jaw above her, set against the effort, and the way one of his hands shifted its grip on her to accommodate a sudden push of current, drawing her fractionally closer, not dramatically, just a 1/4 inch of adjustment that kept everything exactly as it should be. He climbed up the far bank and set her down. He steadied her with one hand at her elbow until she found her footing on the slick mud, and then he let go. He went back across the creek for the horses. He led both of them, his bay by the reins and Dolly by her bridle, along the bank to a narrower upstream point where the animals could cross without being swept, which they did with the resigned dignity of horses who have been through this before. He brought them around to where she was standing and handed Dolly's reins to Evelyn. Neither of them spoke. It was not an awkward silence. It was not the silence of people who do not know what to say. It was the silence of something that had already been said in the water without words, as completely as any conversation Evelyn had ever had. She mounted Dolly. He mounted his bay. They rode back toward town side by side, with the last light going out of the sky and the sound of the flooded creek receding behind them, and the wet mud of the road sucking at the horses' hooves and the stars beginning in the east, and they did not speak, not a word. All the way to the edge of town where their roads divided, and he turned his horse toward the ranch road and she turned Dolly toward Hester's, and they looked at each other for one moment in the dark, and then he rode and she rode, and the silence went with them like something they were carrying carefully so as not to spill it. Evelyn put Dolly in Hester's small stable and brushed her down with hands that were steadier than she expected. She went inside. She ate supper. She went to bed. She lay in her east-facing room with the sound of the wind, and thought about warm and firm and steady, and the beating of a heart through a canvas coat, and she did not try to argue herself out of any of it. Jacob unsaddled his bay and rubbed him down in the barn while Dade stood in the barn door with a lantern, making no comment whatsoever, which was its own kind of comment. Jacob went inside. He sat at the kitchen table. He thought about gray eyes and the way a woman who was accustomed to managing everything had gone completely still in his arms and trusted him to manage this one thing, and the specific quality of that trust, which was not helplessness but something chosen. "You look like a man who's been hit by something," Dade said from the doorway with the kettle in his hand. "I'm fine," Jacob said. Dade put the kettle on the stove. "Sure," he said. "Coffee?" "Yes," Jacob said. They sat with their coffee and the fire, and Dade did not say anything else, which was a kindness Jacob acknowledged silently. He went to town the next morning. He did not have a reason. He went anyway. Evelyn was at the schoolhouse when he arrived. The children were inside, it was a school day, and she was standing in the yard with a broom, sweeping mud off the step he had repaired in November, with the competent, purposeful air of someone doing a practical task while thinking about something else entirely. She looked up when she heard his horse. She stopped sweeping. He dismounted and walked to the yard fence and stopped there with his hat in his hands, which was a thing he had not planned to do. "Miss Beckett," he said. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, "a moment." "I wanted to ask," he said, "if you would have supper with me, at the hotel dining room, Saturday if that's agreeable." The hotel in Dustcreek had a dining room that was its best feature, a proper sit-down meal with tablecloths, which was a distinct step above Hester's excellent but informal kitchen. Evelyn looked at him, he looked back. "Yes," she said, "Saturday." He put his hat back on. "I'll call at 6, he said. "At 6, she agreed. He got back on his horse and rode away, and she stood with her broom and let herself smile at his retreating back, wide and real and private, before she went back inside to her students. Thomas looked up from his reader. "Is that Mr. Ramsey?" he said. "Back to your page, Thomas," she said, and her voice was extremely ordinary. Saturday at 6, he knocked on Hester's door in a clean shirt, and his coat brushed, and his hair combed, and his boots as polished as boots that had recently been through a flooded creek were going to get. Hester opened the door and looked at him with the expression of a woman who knew the specific wait of a moment and said, "She'll be right down," and went to get her knitting. Evelyn came down the stairs in a dress that was dark blue wool, neat and well-made, and she had done her hair up with care, and she looked like herself but with the volume turned up slightly, and Jacob thought that was exactly right. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked to the hotel. The dining room had 4 other couples, and the smells of roasted beef and biscuits, and the particular warmth of a room that is trying its best. They sat at a corner table, and the waiter, a young man of 17 who was doing his level best to be formal, brought them water and menus. They talked for 3 hours. That is the part that matters. Not that they ate, though they did, and the food was good. Not that people in town noticed, though people in town noticed everything. What matters is that they talked for 3 hours without either of them running out of things to say or needing to manufacture a topic. And this had never happened to either of them with another person before, and they both knew it before the meal was half over. She told him about Ohio, about the school she had taught before Cheyenne, in a small town near Columbus, and the school board that had replaced her with a male teacher at a lower salary, and called it necessary economics. She told him with the contained anger of someone who has processed it fully but not made peace with the injustice of it, which he found he respected. He told her about his father, who had built the ranch from nothing and who had worked himself into the ground for it, and who Jacob had loved with the particular love of someone who has not said so enough while the person was living. He told her about the winter he was 17 when a blizzard took 30 head and his father did not sleep for 4 days and Jacob stayed up with him, not because he was needed but because he could not let the man be alone in it. She listened to all of it the way she had held still in his arms in the creek, completely, without filling the space with herself. He walked her home. They stood on Hester's porch in the April cold. "Thank you," she said. "That was a fine evening." "For me too," he said. A pause in which neither of them was quite ready for the porch to be done. "Evelyn," he said. He had not called her that before. Her name in his voice sounded different from how it sounded anywhere else, like it was where it was supposed to be. She looked up at him. "I would like to do this again," he said, "as many times as you would allow it." She felt something in her chest shift and resettle like good furniture finding its true position. "I would allow it frequently," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with those steady eyes, and then he did the most startling thing, which was to take her hand in both of his and hold it briefly, and then let it go, and say good night and walk away. She stood on the porch watching him go and thought that she was in very serious trouble, of the best kind. The spring of 1875 built in the way the best things build incrementally, with intention, with the kind of groundwork that means what gets built will last. They had supper at the hotel on 2 more Saturdays. They walked together on Sunday afternoons along the creek road, now receded to its normal depth, talking about everything and nothing with the easy fluency of people who have found the same frequency. He brought her books from a box his father had kept, old ones, natural histories and a collected edition of Shakespeare, and a volume of American poems that he had read once years ago and thought she might like. She returned each one with her marginalia in the end papers, her responses to lines that had caught her, and when he read her notes, he felt he was reading her mind and found it the most interesting place he had ever visited. He kissed her for the first time in May, on a Sunday afternoon on the creek road, with the cottonwoods budding and the creek running clear again and the sky enormous and blue overhead. They had been standing and looking at a pair of herons on the far bank. She had been excited about the herons in a way that was uncalculated and complete, grabbing his arm and pointing and whispering, "Look, look, there." And when she turned to see if he was looking at the herons, he was looking at her. "Jacob," she said, reading him with those gray eyes. "Evelyn," he said, and that was everything. He kissed her, and she kissed him back with the same completeness she brought to everything she did, and the herons took off from the bank in a long gray sweep of wings, and neither of them noticed. He rode back to the ranch that evening and told Dade absolutely nothing, but Dade took one look at him and said, "Well, it's about time," and went back to checking the harness. June arrived with long days and the smell of grass and the cattle moving well and the school year ending. Evelyn held a small exhibition for the families. The children read aloud and presented their arithmetic work and sang a song she had taught them. And Thomas read a passage from the natural history of the plains, with such authority that his father, Tom Aldridge, sat in the back row and wiped his eyes with his sleeve when he thought no one was looking, and Evelyn was very busy looking at her notes and absolutely did not see it. After the families had gone home and the schoolhouse was empty and the summer stretched ahead in a different kind of way, Evelyn sat on the front step in the late afternoon sun and let herself simply be still for a while. She had been moving in some sense for 4 years. Ohio, then Cheyenne, then Dustcreek, then this town, these children, this work. And there was still work. She would teach again in September, and the summer would have its own demands, but something had changed in the texture of it. Something felt less like survival and more like life. She heard his horse before she saw him, which she was beginning to think was one of the better things about caring for a man who rode, that you got a few extra seconds of anticipation. Jacob came around the schoolhouse corner on foot, having tied his bay at the street, with his hat in his hands and an expression she had learned to read, the one that meant he was about to say something he had been composing for a while. "School's finished," he said. "As of an hour ago," she agreed. He sat on the step beside her. They watched the street, where a dog was investigating something across the way, and the livery stable produced its usual sounds, and a woman with a basket was walking toward Bellamy's. "I want to ask you something," he said. He was turning his hat in his hands. She had never seen him fidget before. It made her heart turn over. "Then ask it," she said. He looked at her, straight on, the way he always looked, with the directness that had unsettled her that first day at Bellamy's counter and now felt like home. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "I would like that more than I have wanted anything in some years. I am not a man who is good with speeches, but I can tell you that I have been happier this spring than I have been since before my father died, and that is because of you, and I do not want it to stop. I want it to be permanent." She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of the step under her, solid and well repaired. She was aware of the school behind her, where she had done real work. She was aware of the valley around her, green from the spring, with the mountains in the west and the creek road to the south, and the whole wide open world of this place that she had chosen and that had improbably chosen her back. "Jacob," she said. "You don't have to answer right now," he said. "I just wanted you to know where I am." "I know where you are," she said. "I always know where you are. That is the thing about you." She turned to face him fully. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you," he exhaled. It was not dramatic. It was simply the release of a man who has been holding something very carefully for a long time and has now set it down safely. He took her hand. She held his. They sat on the schoolhouse step in the June sun, not speaking for a comfortable moment, and then she said, "Hester is going to say about time, and I am going to agree with her." He laughed. A real one, unguarded, the laugh of a man who doesn't do it often, and so when it comes it is entirely genuine. And it changed his face again in the way she had come to love, opening it, making him look younger, making him look like someone who could be happy as a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. They told Hester that evening. Hester said, "About time," and shook Jacob's hand with the grip of a woman who is pleased but will not be sentimental about it. And then she went to find her good sherry, which she had been saving for an occasion. They told Harold Fitch, who was relieved in a paternal way. They told Dade, who said nothing and shook Jacob's hand for a long time, and when Jacob said, "You could say something," Dade said, "I'm saying it," and Jacob had the good sense to leave it at that. They married in July in the Leaning Church, on a Saturday afternoon with the valley in its full summer green, and the mountains visible in every direction, and the whole town of Dustcreek crammed into the pews. Reverend Whitmore performed the service with a warmth that was genuine. Clara Hadley sat in the second row with her mother and brother, and looked at Evelyn with the face of a young woman, witnessing something she is storing away for her own future. Thomas Aldridge sat with his father and wore his best shirt, and held his geography book under his arm, by force of habit. Evelyn wore her mother's wedding ring, which she had carried from Ohio in the bottom of her trunk for years, not knowing quite what she was carrying it for. Now she knew. The vows were simple. The words that mattered they had already said, mostly without words, in a flooded creek in April when he had simply picked her up and carried her through something that was trying to knock them both over, and she had trusted him to do it, and he had not faltered a single step. Jacob said, "I do," in the steady voice of a man who means it fully. Evelyn said, "I do," in the clear voice of a woman who has decided. They were married. The reception was at the church hall, which Hester and the women of Dustcreek had decorated with wildflowers, and had filled with more food than anyone was going to get through, which was the point. There was dancing, a fiddle player named George Marsh, the doctor's younger brother, who could play reels and slow dances and was willing to play all night. Jacob danced with his wife, which he had not told her he could do, and she laughed with surprise at finding this out. "You can dance," she said, as he led her through a reel with more skill than she expected. "My mother taught me," he said. "She said a man who can't dance at his own wedding isn't fit to have one." "I agree with your mother," Evelyn said. They danced 3 dances in a row, and then Dade cut in for the 4th because he claimed it was traditional, which it was not, and Jacob let him because Dade rarely asked for things. They moved into the ranch house 2 weeks after the wedding. Evelyn had packed her room at Hester's with the organized thoroughness of a woman who has moved enough times to be efficient about it. She brought her books, her teaching materials, her mother's ring which was now on her finger, her practical wardrobe, and one thing that surprised Jacob, a framed botanical illustration of prairie wildflowers that she had bought in Cheyenne and carried all this way, and which she hung on the kitchen wall where the morning sun would fall on it. He looked at it for a moment. "I'll put a better nail in," he said. "The nail is fine," she said. "I'll put a better one in," he said again mildly, and went to find a nail, and she let him, because she was learning the particular pleasure of being in a home with someone who noticed things and did something about them quietly. The ranch became a true home in the way that only happens when more than one person is living in it with full intention. Evelyn kept her teaching. She had not considered giving it up, and Jacob had not suggested it. He understood without being told that her work was part of her, the way the ranch was part of him. She rode to school on Dolly in the mornings and back in the afternoons, and he had the coffee ready when she came in, because he was usually back from the morning's work by late afternoon. She learned the ranch. Not all of it immediately, but she paid attention the way she paid attention to everything. And by October she could read the condition of the cattle, understand the water situation, follow the conversation about the north pasture without asking for explanations. Jacob found this extraordinary in a quiet way. He had not expected a partner. He found he had one. She got to know Dade, who was initially cautious with her in the way of a man loyal to one person who is adjusting to the presence of a second. But she was patient with him and genuinely interested in his opinion on things, and by November Dade was treating her with the same unceremonious respect he gave Jacob, which was the highest thing he offered. The young hand, Pete Crane, was Hester's nephew, and Evelyn had known him all year, so that was easy. Ellis, the other hand, was a quiet man of 28 from somewhere south who nodded at her every day and over time began to speak actual sentences, which she counted as progress. The fall brought the question of the neighboring claim. There was land to the east of Ramsey property, 120 acres that had belonged to an old homesteader named Cutter who had died in the spring with no heir. The claim reverted in a complicated way, and there was interest from several quarters, including a speculator from the railroad company, not Harlan Cross, who had been recalled after the legal defeat, but a new man named Alton who had the same smooth manner and the same toolbox of pressure. Jacob was not interested in the land for expansion. He had enough land, but he was concerned about who would get it, because a bad neighbor in the valley could affect water rights at the creek and pasture access in the summer. He went to Fitch's office twice about it and came home from the second meeting looking like a man chewing on something unpleasant. Evelyn set supper on the table and said, "Tell me," he told her. She listened and then she said, "The Crawford family could use that land. James Crawford has been farming 100 acres on the north side and it is not enough for what he is trying to do. Crawford doesn't have the money to file." "He has some," she said. "And if you lent him the filing fee, he could pay it back in installments. You would have a good neighbor instead of a speculator, and the water rights would stay with farming people who know how to use them." Jacob looked at her for a long moment. "That is a better idea than anything I had," he said. "I know," she said without smugness, just factually. He spoke to James Crawford the next week. Crawford was a proud man and the arrangement required care, but Jacob was good at speaking to men about things that mattered without making them feel reduced by it, and Crawford filed his claim the following month. The speculator went away, which was the point. November, and Evelyn realized she was pregnant. She was not surprised exactly. It was a possibility she had been considering for a month, but the certainty of it settled on her with a particular weight that was not fear, but the gravity of something very real. She sat with it for a day, thinking about it, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over everything she needed to understand fully before she spoke. She told Jacob that evening after supper. They were at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the wind coming off the plains and the house solid around them. She said, "I think we are going to have a child." He was very still for a moment. She watched him. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and he said, "Are you well?" "I am well," she said. He pressed her hands and looked at her and looked at her and looked at her, with the most open expression she had ever seen on his face, joy and fear and wonder all at once, unguarded, none of the usual careful composure. "Evelyn," he said, and could not say anything else for a moment. She leaned forward and put her forehead against his. "I know," she said. They sat like that, foreheads together in the lamplight, while the wind moved around the house. She told Hester, who cried, which was the only time Evelyn had ever seen her cry. She told Dr. Marsh, who was practical and reassuring, and told her to eat well and rest when she could, which she did her best to do while also teaching school through December, which she managed because the nausea was manageable, and she was not a person who allowed manageable things to stop her. She told the school board she would need to step back in the late spring, and they arranged for a temporary teacher to finish the spring term, a young woman from Laramie named Miss Patricia Hale, who Evelyn spent 2 afternoons briefing with the thoroughness of someone who plans for her students to be all right in her absence. January came. The pregnancy progressed. Jacob was, Evelyn noted with amusement, considerably more worried about the flooded creek road than she was, and had already planned 2 alternate routes for any possible circumstances that might arise requiring a fast trip to Dr. Marsh. He had told Dade the same routes. He had probably told the horses in his head. "The creek is fine," she told him in February, looking at him over her tea. "In February," he said meaningfully. "It won't flood in February." "April," he said. "I will be very large in April and very stationary," she said. This was, in fact, true. The baby came on the 14th of May, 1876, on a warm morning with the windows open and the meadowlarks going outside and Dr. Marsh present and Hester Crane present and Jacob in the kitchen, not knowing what to do with himself, having been firmly told by Hester to be in the kitchen. The labor was long and hard, and Evelyn managed it with the same determined competence she brought to everything. And Dr. Marsh said afterward that she was the most focused patient he had ever attended, which was both a compliment and accurate. The baby was a boy. He weighed 8 pounds and had dark hair, and made his opinions known immediately and loudly. Jacob was allowed into the room. He sat on the edge of the bed and held his son and looked at Evelyn, who was tired to the bone but luminously, completely alive, and he said very quietly, "He has your eyes." She looked. The baby's eyes, unfocused and dark as new things are, held some promise of gray. "We'll see," she said. "I'm sure of it," Jacob said. They named him William for Jacob's father. Will almost immediately. Will Ramsey was, from the first weeks, a person of serious opinions and considerable volume. He ate with dedication and slept with the same. He regarded the world from Jacob's arms and Evelyn's arms with an identical look of focused assessment that made both of them laugh constantly. Dade was entirely undone by Will. This was the most surprising domestic development of the year. Dade, who expressed affection for nothing except horses and the quality of a properly maintained fence, took one look at Will at 6 weeks old and became completely soft. He visited the house more often. He stood in doorways watching Will sleep with an expression Jacob had never seen on his face. He carved a wooden rattle very carefully over a period of 2 weeks and presented it without comment. Will immediately found it fascinating. "You're softer than a spring calf," Jacob told Dade one morning. "I am well within normal parameters," Dade said, and went to check the fence. Evelyn went back to teaching in September, when Will was 4 months old, with a careful arrangement. Hester came to the ranch house 3 mornings a week to sit with Will, and on the other mornings Jacob managed the ranch timing around the house, which he did without complaint, having decided that this was simply what was true, and that fitting his work around it was no more remarkable than fitting it around weather. The school had 17 children again, and Thomas was now 11 and had moved into a different category of student, the kind who pushes the teacher as much as she pushes him. Evelyn was extremely pleased about this and spent the fall term finding him harder problems. Clara Hadley had turned 15 and was beginning to talk about wanting to go to a proper school in Laramie. Evelyn wrote a letter on her behalf to the Laramie Academy and spent 3 conversations with Clara's parents, who were proud and anxious in equal measure, until they were persuaded that Clara's education was worth the sacrifice. Clara left in January of 1877 with a trunk and a determination that made Evelyn think of her own trunk, her own January, and what it had led to. She told Jacob about it that evening, lying in bed with Will asleep in his cradle across the room and the winter dark outside and the lamplight going low. "I keep thinking about September of '74, she said. "Arriving here, not knowing what it was going to be." "What did you think it was going to be?" he asked from beside her in the comfortable darkness. She thought about it. "I thought it was going to be a job," she said, "decent enough, something I was good at, a way to exist. And instead—" She turned to look at him, this man she had chosen and who had carried her across a flooded creek without being asked, and without making it a performance or a debt, who had asked her to marry him sitting on a schoolhouse step with his hat in his hands, who held their son like the most important thing that had ever been placed in his keeping. And instead it became everything, she said. He reached across and took her hand in the dark. His thumb traced her knuckle, the one with her mother's ring, and stayed there. "For me too," he said. They lay quiet. The wind moved around the ranch house, which was solid and built to last, and Will made a small sound in his sleep and resettled, and the fire in the bedroom grate gave its low warmth. The spring of 1877 came in gently, as though the winter had decided to leave without argument. The creek road flooded again in March briefly, and Evelyn stood on the bank with Will on her hip and looked at the water with a private smile that Jacob, coming up behind her, recognized as belonging to something he was not going to ask about in front of the baby. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About April of last year," she said, "and the year before that." He stood next to her and looked at the creek, running fast and brown and cold in the March light. "I was coming back from checking the Hadley fence line," he said. She looked at him. "When I came around the bend and saw you there," he said, "I was coming back from the east. I wasn't going to town. I just came around the bend and there you were." She stared at him. "You never told me that." "I was coming back from the fence," he said, "and then I was doing the one thing I was always going to do whenever I came around a bend and found you standing there needing to get across." She was quiet for a moment. The creek ran. Will put his fist in his mouth and thought about the water with great seriousness. "You never told me that," she said again, differently this time. "I'm telling you now," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her, which brought Will into the arrangement, and Will looked at the creek and said a definitive sound that might have been a word or might have been an opinion, and both his parents laughed. They walked home along the creek road with the mountains to the west and the valley going green around them. The summer of 1877 was a good one, good rains, good grass, the cattle doing well. The legal case about the homesteads was long settled. The Crawford family's east claim was productive. The town of Dustcreek had added a new brick building for the bank and a second dry goods store, signs of the modest but real prosperity that came with the railroad being settled elsewhere, and the valley keeping its character. Dade's cough, which had come and gone over the past 3 years, was finally properly diagnosed by Dr. Marsh as a chronic lung condition that was not dangerous if managed carefully, meaning no more riding in the deep winter cold. This created the question of how to restructure the ranch work for the winter months, and Jacob solved it by promoting young Pete Crane to foreman duties for the winter season, which Pete accepted with the quiet seriousness of a young man who has been preparing for exactly this responsibility without quite knowing it. Evelyn made a point of telling Pete, the next time she saw him, that she thought it was exactly right. Pete went slightly red and said thank you, Miss Beckett, which he had always called her and probably always would. Will turned one in May with a party that Hester organized with the same efficient pleasure she brought to everything. The cake was a genuine cake, made with real butter, and Will applied himself to it with focused enthusiasm, and came out of the experience covered in frosting and extremely pleased with himself. Thomas Aldridge, now 12 and already reading things above what any of the adults had suggested, came to the party and presented Will with a picture book he had acquired from somewhere, and explained the pictures to the baby with great seriousness. He likes the one with the horses, Thomas reported to Jacob. He is a ranch baby, Jacob said. It's natural. Evelyn watched this conversation from the doorway with the feeling she was always having these days, which was a kind of ongoing wonder that things had arranged themselves into this specific shape. She had come to Dustcreek because a job existed and she needed a job, and she had stayed because the children needed teaching and the creek had flooded, and a man she had not expected had picked her up without being asked and carried her through the part that was trying to knock her over. Hester appeared at her elbow. "You're doing it again," Hester said. "What?" Evelyn said. "Standing in doorways looking at your family with that expression," Hester said. "The one that's going to make me say something embarrassing." "Then don't say it," Evelyn said. "I'll just think it," Hester said, and went to cut more cake. Evelyn smiled and went into the room with her family. The years continued, as years do, with the particular rhythm of a life that has found its shape. The school grew 22 students by the fall of 1878, when the valley's population had increased with 2 new farming families from Kansas and 1 from Minnesota. Evelyn requested and received a part-time assistant teacher, a young woman of 20 from the nearest settlement east, named Ruth Cannon, who was capable and kind, and whom Evelyn taught to teach with the same systematic generosity she had given the children. Will walked at 11 months and talked early and with conviction, which surprised no one. He was a child who had, from the beginning, specific opinions about everything, and articulating them seemed important to him. By 2, he was following Jacob around the ranch with small, dedicated steps and asking questions about everything he encountered. "Papa, why is the cow doing that?" "She's eating, Will." "But why?" "Because she's hungry." "But why is she hungry?" This could continue indefinitely. Jacob answered every question with the same patient completeness, which Evelyn thought was one of the most important things she had ever observed him do. Evelyn was pregnant again in the late fall of 1878, and this time the pregnancy was easier in the first months and harder in the last, and the baby came in June of 1879 on a cooler day than Will's birth, with a storm building in the west and Dr. Marsh present again, and Jacob again in the kitchen having been again told firmly to stay there. This time the baby was a girl. 7.5 pounds, fair-haired, in a way that surprised them both since neither was fair, and Jacob held her and said she had his mother's coloring, which he said with a kind of wondering pleasure. They named her Margaret. Maggie. Will, who was 3, inspected his sister with the deep seriousness of someone taking on a new responsibility, and announced that she was very small and he would protect her. Jacob looked at Evelyn over Will's serious 3-year-old head with an expression so full of something good and private that she had to press her lips together to keep from laughing, because laughing was not the appropriate response to the gravity of Will's announcement, but she could not help it. "He's going to be something," Jacob said that evening. "He already is something," Evelyn said. "He is very much something." Maggie was a quieter soul than her brother from the beginning, watchful, with eyes that tracked everything, but when she smiled, it rearranged your whole day. She smiled at Dade on her second week of life, and Dade was thereafter completely helpless, which was at least consistent with his previous behavior. The ranch had, over the 5 years of their marriage, expanded modestly and intentionally. Not for the sake of size, but for the sake of security, another 30 acres to the south, bought when they came available, which gave them better access to the creek in dry years. Jacob had added a proper barn addition and rebuilt the bunkhouse for the hands, and Evelyn had, over 2 years, extended the kitchen and added a proper study to the house, where she kept her teaching materials and her books. The botanical illustration of prairie wildflowers still hung in the kitchen where the morning sun found it, on the nail Jacob had replaced in the first week of their marriage. When Maggie was old enough to notice it, she was fascinated by it, pressing her small finger to the printed flowers one by one while Evelyn named them for her. "And that one?" Maggie said. "Wild columbine," Evelyn said. "Columbine," Maggie repeated very precisely. "That's right," Evelyn said. "You sound like your father." Maggie looked satisfied. Dustcreek in 1880 was not what it had been in 1874. It had a proper brick schoolhouse now, the money raised partly by the town, partly by a donation from the Ramsey family that Evelyn had insisted was not ostentatious, but was practical, and partly by a grant from the Territorial Education Fund that Evelyn had applied for, written in the precise and persuasive language of a woman who has learned to get things done on paper. It had a proper doctor's office, since Dr. Marsh had invested in a real building. It had the railroad spur running 12 miles to the north, which had ended up serving the valley without destroying it, because the route had been routed around the homesteads and not through them. The Homestead families were still on their land: the Crawfords, the Hadleys, the Pikes. Clara Hadley had come back from Laramie with her education and was teaching at the school at the south end of the valley, in a settlement that had grown enough to need its own teacher. She had written Evelyn a letter that Evelyn kept in the study desk, folded carefully, that said, "You showed me it was possible to be a woman and be serious about the world at the same time, and I did not know that before you." Evelyn had read this letter and then looked at the wall for a while. On a Saturday in October of 1880, Evelyn and Jacob rode out together on the South Road, something they did when the children were with Hester and the weather was good, and the time could be borrowed from the week's accounts. They rode along the creek, which was low and clear in the October drought, the willows yellow-leafed and the mountains layered blue and purple in the distance. They stopped at the crossing. The ford where, 6 years ago, she had stood on Dolly and looked at the flooded water and he had come around the bend. It was passable now without effort. The horses walked through with water at their knees, their reflection barely disturbed. "I think about it sometimes," she said, looking at the crossing. "What would have happened if it had not flooded that particular day?" "You would have ridden across," he said, "and I would have found some other reason." She looked at him. "Would you?" He looked at the water and then at her. "Yes," he said. "I think it was always going to be you, Evelyn, from that first morning at Bellamy's counter. I just needed the right moment to be in the same place as my nerve." She laughed. She reached across from Dolly's saddle and took his hand, which required leaning somewhat, and he steadied her automatically. "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said," she told him. "Don't tell Dade," he said. "He'll never let me hear the end of it." She laughed again, and he kept hold of her hand across the space between the horses, and they stayed like that for a while in the October light, with the mountains to the west and the creek running clear at their feet, and the whole of the life they had built together sitting around them like good solid ground. "We should go back," she said, eventually. "Will has been trying to get Hester to teach him to play cards for a week, and I don't trust the situation." "Will is 6, Jacob said. "Will is very intelligent and 6, she said meaningfully. They turned the horses toward home. The years that followed had their weight and their ordinary miracles, the way all years do when you are paying attention. Will turned 7, then 8, then 10, reading everything he could find and learning the ranch with the same whole-bodied commitment he brought to everything. He could ride well by 7, and by 10 was doing genuine work, not as labor but as belonging, as the natural expression of being the son of a ranch. Maggie, quieter and more watchful, turned 5 and then 6, and discovered that she had a gift for drawing that surprised everyone except Evelyn, who had noticed it at 3 when Maggie traced the botanical illustration on the kitchen wall with her finger every day. She drew animals first, then landscapes, then people's small, precise images that captured something essential. Jacob put one of her drawings of the barn on the wall of his study, above his father's land maps, and it stayed there. Evelyn taught school until the fall of 1882, when Ruth Cannon, now confident and fully capable, took over the primary classroom, and Evelyn moved to the role of supervising the curriculum across both the Dustcreek School and Clara Hadley's South Valley School. This was a new thing, an informal school district, not officially recognized by the territory but functionally organized, and Evelyn ran it with the precision and warmth that had always characterized her teaching, just scaled to 2 schools and 2 teachers instead of one of each. It was important work. The Valley's children were better educated than children in comparable territories, and this was measurable in the ones who went on to Laramie and beyond, and in the ones who stayed and farmed and ranched with more knowledge than their parents had brought to it. Evelyn knew this. She did not say it out loud, but she knew it. Dade Sullivan's health declined slowly and then quickly in the winter of 1882. The lung condition that had been manageable became something Dr. Marsh was honest about. It was not going to get better, and the cold was not his friend, and there were limits to what could be done in 1882 for a man whose chest had been working too hard for too long. Dade spent the last weeks of that winter in the room off the ranch house kitchen that had been Ellis's room before Ellis moved on to his own land, and Jacob and Evelyn looked after him with the same unhurried attention he had given the ranch for 15 years. He died on a March morning, the same month the creek flooded as it always did, with the sun coming through the window and Jacob sitting in the chair by the bed and Evelyn having brought tea that went cold on the side table. He died with the specific peace of a man whose accounts are settled. Jacob was quiet about it in the way he was quiet about the things that went deepest. He did not cry until he was in the barn alone, which Evelyn knew because she knew him completely by now, and she let him have the barn, and then she found him there an hour later and sat on the hay bale next to him and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. They buried Dade in the Dustcreek Cemetery on a clear, cold day, and Pete Crane gave the eulogy, which was short and exactly right, and Thomas Aldridge, now 17 and taller than everyone, stood with his hat in his hands and looked at the grave with the solemn expression he had carried since he was 6. Spring came through after the grief, as it always does. Will went back to his questions and his books and the ranch. Maggie brought Evelyn a drawing she had done of Dade, from memory, precise and kind, the way she drew everything. Jacob put it in the study next to the barn drawing, and there it stayed. Pete Crane became full foreman, officially and with a raise that was deserved. 2 new hands came on young men, both capable, one of whom was James Crawford's son, which felt right. The ranch worked. The land was good. In the summer of 1883, 9 years after Evelyn had stepped off the stagecoach with her leather trunk and her hatbox into a bruise-colored morning, she sat on the porch of the ranch house with her husband in the long evening light. The mountains were purple and close in the summer air. Will was in the barn doing something he had been very specific about not needing help with. Maggie was inside drawing at the kitchen table by lamplight, the scratch of her pencil just audible through the open window. Jacob had his coffee. She had her tea. They had been sitting long enough for the silence to be easy. "Are you happy?" she asked him, not because she didn't know, but because sometimes it was worth saying the things out loud. He looked at her with those same brown eyes that had not changed, the direct ones, the ones that were simply very much present. "Evelyn," he said, "I am so entirely happy that I don't have enough words for it, and I have always had fewer words than most, so I'll just tell you that the answer is yes. Completely." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He shifted his arm around her, the familiar weight of it, the anchor of it. "Good," she said. "Me too." The creek road to the south was quiet in the evening light. the willows throwing long shadows, the water catching the last of the gold. Somewhere down the valley, a meadowlark said what meadowlarks say at the end of a Wyoming day, one clear sustained line of sound, and then silence. And the silence that followed was the kind that comes when everything is where it ought to be. Will came out of the barn, finally, having apparently resolved whatever had required his private effort, and crossed the yard with the purposeful walk of a boy who would be taller than his father by 15 and who already knew it. He climbed the porch steps that Jacob had built with the same care he gave everything that needed to last, and looked at his parents with the assessing gaze he shared with his mother. "Are you just sitting there?" he asked. "Yes," Jacob said. "For what reason?" "Because it's evening," Evelyn said, "and your father has worked all day and I have worked all day, and we are sitting on our porch and looking at our valley." Will considered this. He sat on the step below them and looked at the valley with the same consideration. "It's a good valley," he said at length. "It is," Jacob agreed. Maggie appeared in the doorway with her pencil still in her hand and her drawing still on her mind. She looked at the three of them, her parents on the porch chairs, her brother on the step, and then came out and sat beside Will and put her pencil behind her ear and looked at the mountains. "Are the mountains going to change color again?" she asked. "Wait a minute," Evelyn said. They waited. The mountains went from purple to blue-gray to the particular deep rose that happened for about 5 minutes on clear summer evenings, and Maggie watched it with the focused attention she gave everything beautiful, and then found the drawing side of her mind the way she always did, mentally translating what she saw into what she would put on paper later. Jacob sat with his wife and his children in the last of the evening and felt the fullness of it, the specific, earned, irreplaceable fullness of a life that had been built by choice and kept by work and graced by things he had not planned for but had not turned away from. A woman at a general store counter. A flooded creek. 2 words spoken across a church supper. A schoolhouse step in June. And in between all of it and around all of it and underneath all of it, the simple sustained reality of 2 people who had found each other in a Wyoming valley in 1874 and decided every day since to stay found. The evening closed around them. The stars came out. The ranch house held its warmth behind them. The valley lay quiet and enormous in the dark, and Sawyer's Creek ran along its usual path, low in the summer, over the stones of the crossing where it had once run fast and brown and cold, where a man had walked into the current and carried a woman through, and where neither of them had spoken after, because some things are said completely without words. This was one of those things, and it lasted all their lives.